Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. So we're off I took a break myself there now for the last 2 weeks, so back to the grindstone this week now. So it might seem like a strange topic that we're covering today in terms of the economics of late calving cows, but James will be talking about it now in particular, so I'm not going to steal any of his lines basically, but we are at a point now where we can eliminate some of the late calvers that we're going to be talking about. Obviously there's a proportion of them that we won't be able to eliminate. But I suppose just going through the idea behind it, I suppose, like, again, James is going to show it, there's still quite a lot of cows in spite of our progress in 6-week calving rate with the last number of years moving up into the 60s only, really, to be honest. Now, while we have farms that are doing the 80s, high 80s and the 90s, on average across the country, we're still only calving 60 to 63-4% in 6 weeks in terms of the spring calving block. So that means that there's quite a number of cows still calving quite late relative to the grass growing season, which we're trying to take advantage of. And James is just going to, I suppose, give a little bit of background first, I suppose, in relation to the actual late calving cows, timing of insemination versus or serve versus when they're going to calve at this stage now, and then go through an example in terms of how changing that can be a positive for our farm. And in particular, I would say from a labour point of view, that those late calving cows, especially in herds of cows now, as I said to you before, that are in the range of 100 cows on average across the country. Those couple of cows that they might be only a few cows in every farm, but those couple of cows that are calving that in May and June can actually impact on breeding performance in terms of submission rates for the actual herds that have done their job and gone back in calf at the right stage. And it just makes it quite tiresome for people as well when they're trying to breed cows. Maybe watch a couple of cows that are still to calve and obviously look after the calf when it's born as well. So I'll hand over to you, James, to go through your slides, and as we said, I'll hop in and out with a few questions as we're going along, and I'd encourage people to put in questions as well there on the Q&A as we go along too. So thanks, James.
Perfect, thanks, Stuart, and thanks for inviting me on. I suppose, I want to say at the outset, my colleague George Ramsbottom has put a lot of the economics together, and I suppose I've built on it a little bit with a farm scenario at the end. So we want to thank George for his input, I suppose, and make that clear from the start. As you said, Stuart, I want to have a quick chat around decisions around ending the breeding season, and this will have happened on some farms at this stage and may not have happened on others. So we'll have a quick chat on that. We'll spend a good bit of time looking at the economics around milking through the winter. So milking these late calving cows on, what's the economics around that? And also in terms of the margins of finishing these late calving cows on farm, we'll have a look at the economics around that. We then have, Stuart, a real life farm scenario. So I suppose a farmer I worked with there a number of weeks ago, and some of the key considerations, I suppose, that he took into consideration around the timing of ending the breeding season, and I suppose how he wanted to try and tighten up a somewhat lax calving pattern to benefit both him and the farm. So I
suppose, James, as well, the other side before you go on is like, this isn't maybe, well, there's two scenarios here that you're going to go through. There's the nuclear scenario where you just stop it and start from scratch nearly, or hit the reset button. But there's also what you're going to look at here is actually trying to manage your way through this process over the next maybe 2 to 3 years to get to a scenario where you're back to where you want to be in terms of calving pattern, really, like, as well.
Absolutely, sure. And some people will decide, as you said, to maybe try and reset and start afresh, whereas some people maybe over a 2 or 3 year period will look to tighten up calving patterns and work their way through it that way. And I suppose even from the economics point of view, Stuart, I'll be going through a number of assumptions, and those assumptions can change somewhat, but they won't differ in terms of the economics that greatly when we're looking at the milking through economics and the finishing of late calving cows. So we'll have a chat about those assumptions as we go in terms of what we're actually using for the economics that I'm going to present. So just a quick summary in terms of our national calving stats. We've about 1.4 million calvings from January to June over a rolling 3 year period. Of that, 65,000 cows calve in January, 521,000 cows calve in February, 483,000 cows calve in March. But I suppose the group of cows, Stuart, that we're going to talk about today really is that kind of the group from April till June. You made the point, we are making progress, albeit maybe somewhat slower than we'd like it to be, with 25% of our cows nationally calving from April to June. So 1 in 4 cows, I suppose, in the national average herd is calving sometime between April and June. So look at just a quick recap, and for some of these dates at the top of this table, the ship has sailed as such, but I think it's no harm to actually recap. If we actually look at breeding date and assume a gestation length of 285 days, where is our expected calving date? So I suppose for farms that want to be finished up calving by the end of April, first day of May, you're looking at the 20th of July. So bull come out a month ago. And we can work our way down through that. I suppose, Stuart, one date that is coming up is tomorrow's the 20th of August. Anyone that pulls the bull tomorrow, I suppose, will ensure that there's no June calvers on the farm next June 2022. So that is one of the dates that's still achievable, I suppose. And when we do actually look, as I said, nearly 50,000 cows calve in June around the country. So bull can come out tomorrow, and it'll mean that we will have no June calvers next year. So to get into a little bit of the economics, and when we actually look at it, if we look at a group of cows that can deliver 6,500 litres or 500 kilos of milk solids, and we look at them on per month of calving, the arrow here you can see coming down in mid-February, I suppose, is a typical turnout date. And Stuart, you mentioned it in terms of what we're actually trying to achieve is to produce as much of that lactation off grazed grass and lower levels of concentrate input as possible. And I suppose if we put in a typical dry-off date there of mid-December, we can see that February calf cow can produce her full lactation, 305-day lactation, for 6,500 litres or 500 kilos of milk solids within that period. And if we look to the right of the table in terms of a feed and forage cost on a per cow basis, it works out at €608. And we look at the breakdown of that on the next slide. But that February calf cow, we know, has the cheapest feed cost out of all our counterparts on that table. If we work our way down through the table then and actually look at from what can we actually produce between that mid-February to mid-December period. So our March calf cow, with the potential, as I said, to deliver 6,500 litres, will deliver just over 6,000 litres. Our April calf cow, 5,600 litres. Our May calf cow, just over 5,200 litres. And our June calver, which I spoke about on the last slide, will deliver 4,700 litres of our 6,500 litre potential in our 305 day. So I suppose, Stuart, what it means is that there's a larger proportion of their milk being produced from the 15th of December on over that winter period.
Yeah, so just to point out, James, I suppose that the 6013 there for the March calver plus the 488, which is over here by March, is going to bring it up to the 6,500. And all of these numbers, when they're put together, are equivalent to the January calver, we'll say. But they're all producing 6,500, but it's just when they're producing it is what is the difference, basically.
Absolutely, Stuart. And I suppose,
of course, then as well, with your June calver there or your May calver, where your drop down line is coming for December, they obviously have a lot less milk supplied if they're dried off at that stage in particular.
Exactly. You have an extra 1,268 litres to produce over that winter period for your May calver, and nearly 1,800 litres for that June calver that has to be produced from the 15th of December onwards. So when we actually look at the feed cost then, Stuart, as a result, we can see And we'll see on the next slide, the level of grazed grass in the diet, the total level consumed is reduced. So the level of concentrate and silage increases. So we can see our February calf cow there. And it's worth pointing out, that's a very good cost of production at 608 euros from a feed cost point of view. But that increases from 608 to 647 for our March calver, to 674 for our April, 734 for our May, and up until 753 euros for our June. So there's 145 euros of an additional feed cost from your February to June calver.
Doesn't sound huge, James, but when you take that there's 25% of the national herd calving in that later period,
when you add up your April, May, and June calvers exactly, and put 25% of your herd in there, and calculate that out. Don't forget, Stuart, that's feed and forage only, I suppose. There's no additional labour, overhead costs in terms of running the parlour and so on and so forth. So that's additional feed only. But you're right, 25% of the herd, when we actually look at 25% of the herd in here, it mightn't seem a lot on an individual cow basis, but it adds up when we multiply it across at herd level. Just have a quick look in terms of where those figures actually come from. And if we look at that February calf cow, you pointed out, Stuart, we're wanting to calve her down to grass. We want to consume as much grass as we can. And there, that February calf cow is consuming just in or around 4 tonne of grazed grass, just over a tonne of silage, 1,029 kilos, and a concentrate input level of 525 kilos. And that's what gives us that 608 euros of a total feed and forage costs. When we work our way down in terms of the grass column, you can actually see that obviously that the level of grazed grass consumed is reducing to just over 3.5 tonne for a March calver, and it tails off to right down to just over 2.5 tonne for the June calver. So there's 1.5 tonne of potential grazed grass there that isn't being consumed by that June calver. So you can actually see that in terms of the silage consumed, it doubles, Stuart, from the February calver. It goes from just over 1 tonne of silage consumed to just over 2 tonne of silage consumed. There's an extra 340 kilos of additional concentrate in there as well. And I suppose that's where that 145 euros of an additional feed charge comes from. It's worth mentioning, I suppose, the January calver as well, because they're spending the first 30 days, Stuart, of their lactation inside. So there is an additional silage demand and also additional concentrate demand, which is pushing that feed cost up by the best part of 53 or 4 euros compared to their February counterpart that goes to grass.
There's the question in there now, James, as well, and I suppose it's a very valid point, because even with the meal figures that we're using there for this assumption, they're probably better than, or they're definitely better than the national average, because we're probably 750 to 800 on average. But if the silage quality is in the mid-60s DMD compared to mid-70s, how does that affect the extra cost of milking through?
Absolutely, and what we see on those farms, Stuart, is that rather than, we've worked off 5 kilos of meal for every extra day in milk, but where we see is that there's actually additional feeds going in, let it be maybe more concentrate or some other forms of additional forages, to try and ensure that lactation, I suppose, potential is met. Yeah. So the feed costs will work further. As I said, this is a very, very good level. The base is a very good cost of production level. So this will be much greater on some farms where forage quality is below optimal. So look to put it in a herd context as such, and if we use the national calving profile for a 100 cow herd, 5% of the cows calve in January, 36% in February, 34% in March, 14% in April, 8% in May, and 3% in June. The ship has sailed as such, Stuart, for the 20th of July, in terms of to avoid these next year. But as I say, tomorrow is D-Day as such for the June calvers. If we don't want them, we need to finish the breeding season tomorrow.
I suppose, James, just before you go on there, it's a critical point in that sense, in that we were discussing it before we came on air there, like that the reality is if cows go in calf on a farm, the vast majority of farmers do not sell them, in spite of maybe intending to sell them. When it actually comes to the, as you call it, we'll say if you take a D-Day next spring and they decide that they're going to get rid of these June calvers, the proportion of people that actually do that isn't huge. So if you're not in the habit of selling those late calvers, and you find that you'll fall into that scenario every year, don't put them in calf, or otherwise you're going to stay in the exact same position that you're in.
Could be just telling you, Stuart, that they're going to sell them because it shuts the conversation down right away, I suppose. Whether they're sold or not is a different story. As you say, often they're not sold on farms. There's a lot of talk about adding value to cull cows, and they'll be more in calf. And I suppose when we look at the economics going forward here, Stuart, how you cull cows, I suppose, from our point of view, doesn't really matter, and people will cull cows different ways, and we look at adding value maybe to these cull cows. But the important thing is that the cow is culled, and that the repeat situation doesn't happen over and over. It's really breaking that cycle, I suppose, is the important point. The one thing I will say is, if everybody decides to put the May and June calvers in calf and cash in on them, there's probably a bit of a niche market there. And niche markets are only niche markets when they're undersubscribed.
Yeah.
So I think, look, at that, that's an important point to note.
And again, just before you move on there now, James, you're ideally positioned to answer this question now, because Tony McCrossan is asking for people in the extreme northwest. You wouldn't have many days at grass in January and February. So would you care to comment in that sense?
Yep. Look, I'm based in Ballyhaise. Stuart's based in Moore Park, so we our spring turnout dates differ slightly. And look, there's been a lot of work done on that. Really, I suppose that's where calving start date, Stuart, will dictate, I suppose, when we look at turnout date. And there's a lot of trial work done in Ballyhaise, and probably the start date is 2 to 3 weeks, 2 weeks probably later than our counterparts in the south. But I suppose even on the heavy soils farms, and we've a great example, or a couple of great examples in the northern half of the country, they can actually maybe get lots of grazing done in February, sometimes, Stuart, and March could be the tough month. So I think a lot of these farms, they're still working off the same principles, but there's probably days, Stuart, where they're not going to get to grass, and they just have to put in high quality silage. But I don't think it shouldn't change the key principles that we're working around. It just means that we may not be fit to achieve as many grazing days in the spring as our counterparts that have a very dry farm.
Yeah, and I suppose, James, this is kind of a good time to mention Emma Louise did a good podcast there with Danny Birmingham only a week or two this week, I think, actually. And Danny's a great guy.
He's a fantastic example.
Like, he's working on really challenging soil now, and like achieving high days with a very compact calving, and he sees compact calving as being a very important piece of his jigsaw, having come from a scenario kind of like what you're talking about there currently, like. So I think that's well worth people listening into as well. So
absolutely. So look, if we actually look at these cows and possibly adding value, or what is the margin in terms of milking these cows on? We said we've looked at this national average stats across 100 cows. That March calver is going to be milked on into the middle of January, and dried off. Obviously, each cow is going to be dried off 60 days prior to calving. So middle of January, they'll be milked on in terms of the March calvers, middle of February, the April, middle of March, the May, and middle of April, the June calvers. So when we look at that, we've 34 March calves cows. They're going to produce 488 litres. So as Stuart rightly pointed out, that's the additional milk in terms of that 6,500 litres. And that's bringing those cows up to a 305-day lactation. So that produces 16.5, just over 16,500 litres. Same calculation across for our April calvers produces just over 12,000 litres. Our May calvers, obviously there's less of them, but they're producing still a long way to go in terms of their lactation. So there's just over 10,000 litres. And our June calvers, 1,788 litres by 3 cows, is just 5,364 litres. So in total, that 100 cow herd will produce, or should produce, 44,392 litres of additional milk. So I suppose the point to make here, Stuart, is there's still a large proportion of annual revenue that is to be produced because that calving pattern, I suppose, isn't where we'd like it to be. Really, this equates to 30 days of milk per cow across that 100 cow herd. So if we want to bring all the cows to a 305-day lactation, we're milking them all in this situation. If we don't and we dry off, Stuart, on the 15th of December, our average days in milk for the herd will be back at 275 days. So as I say, there's a large proportion of milk to be produced because we have such a large number of those later calvers in the herd. Compare that, I suppose, with where we'd like our calving patterns to be, and I suppose where the target is, Stuart, in terms of maybe 70% calving in February, 20% in March, and 10% in April. The difference is 18,500 litres produced versus 44,392 litres. So less than half. And I suppose we know herds with a good calving profile, they've lower production costs, but they also, as we can see there, have much less milk produced after the 15th of December. And I suppose the decision around milking on in this situation, Stuart, if we give the fact that these March calvers, there's 20 of them, but they're only going to be milked on till the 15th of January, and they have to be dried off as we're taking it that they're going to calve down in March again, the mid-March again. There's 10 cows left there in that herd to milk from the 15th of January to whenever calving start date is, we'll say the first days of February. So obviously in a lot of cases, in these situations, that the option of milking on, and as you rightly said to me a number of weeks ago, there has to be a number. There's a time in herds where the number of cows gets that small where the economics don't add up in terms of starting the parlour morning and evening, you know. So look at same number of cows, lacks calving pattern, I suppose, national average versus where we'd like it to be. There's a massive difference in terms of the milk produced over that period of time. From the
very roughly, James, is about 10 grand in the difference in those profiles there at the moment, based on kind of current average milk prices, like.
Exactly, and this equates to 12 days in milk. So you're going to get 293 days in milk of an average across that 100 cows with that calving pattern up until the 15th of December. So we're going to actually look at those figures exactly that you mentioned, Stuart. There's two periods really to be analysed. There's the overwinter milking margin, and there's also a fattening margin. And we look at both sets of economics, and we can combine both sets of economics. So if we look at that overwinter milking period, I'm not going to run through each line because the calculation is the same, but we spoke about our 488 litres. There's an extra 31 days in milk there. The milk value is €185. We're taking off our feed, forage and overhead costs, and I just want to maybe bring you to the assumptions in terms of where they're coming from. So our total milk price, Stuart, is 38 cents a litre used in this analysis. 34-cent base and 4-cent bonuses, okay? Meal price of 32 cents a kilo, with 5 kilos fed per head per extra day in milk. A silage price of 15 cents a kilo, dry matter, and there's an additional 3 kilos fed per head per extra day in milk. And what I mean by that is, if the cows were dry, they would be consuming a certain amount of silage anyway. So all we're adding in there is the additional silage consumed because that animal is obviously lactating and intakes are going to be greater. And then there's an overhead cost of 50 cents per cow per day in terms of the running of the parlour. I have to make the point, Stuart, that own labour isn't included there. So when we're looking at these margins, that has to be considered. It's really a margin for own labour. Another point to make, I suppose, is for each additional day in milk, and those figures, it's €2.55 of feed, forage and overhead costs. Okay. So we can see as we work across there, the margin for that March calf cow is €106. The April calf cow is €176. The May calf cow is €252, and the June calf cow is €371. Okay. Obviously, it's increasing fairly dramatically given the amount and proportion of milk and the days extra in milk as we work our way down through the table. So what does it actually mean for that 100 cow herd that we actually looked at? We can see our 44,000 litres, or just over 44,000 litres that we spoke about is produced here. We're using the 38 cent a litre price assumption that we're working off, which equates to €16,859 in additional milk revenue. The feed, forage and overhead costs, as I stated on the previous slide, are €2.55 a day for each additional day per cow, and that works out at €7,665. So when we look at the margin, Stuart, in terms of milking on in that herd for a 100 cow herd, it's €9,194 or €91 a cow across the full herd. Yeah. So you're looking at the best part of €100 per cow across the full 100 cows. Compare that then to where we'd like our calving pattern to be, I suppose. We spoke about the 18,500 litres. Extra milk sales there work into just over 7,000, with the feed and forage and overhead costs working into just over €3,000. And that leaves a margin of €3,883, or €38 a cow across the full 100 cows. I suppose
I suppose I'd make the argument there, James, then as well, like in the vast majority of cases, that's really only going to be that 2,128 from the March calvers, because those April calvers are going to be dried off at the same time.
Absolutely.
In the majority of cases.
So we're looking at about 20% of the revenue compared to the exact same size herd at national calving stats.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We look at the fattening costs, and this happens on some farms, Stuart. It doesn't happen on other farms, and we'll work our way through it in terms of what the actual margins is on it. There's a number of assumptions here which we'll work on. I'll try and explain it before I explain the figures. So I suppose we're looking at a dry period here of 30 days. Intakes assumed there are that kind of 10 kilos dry matter a day. The finishing period is for 60 days at 13 kilos dry matter intake a day. We're working off a carcass weight of 271 kilos and a grade of 03, and that's 43% kill out percentage. The slaughter values that we've used is based off CSO and Irish Farmers Journal data for the months April till July from 2017 to 2020. So the average across that period for each month. So your April price is $3.10 a kilo. Your May price is $3.30. Your June price is $3.22. And your July price is €3.17 a kilo. The margin assumes a live weight of dry off at 570 kilos, which is approximately €15 maintenance sub-index. So something in and around where we're at nationally, Stuart. And the opportunity cost, I suppose, because there is an opportunity cost in terms of selling this cow directly out of the parlour. The opportunity cost to cull that cow live at dry off is assumed at €1 live weight in January, €1.10 in February and €1.20 in March and April. As I say, those figures come from that period of time as well, so the average over that period. So if we'll take our March as an example. The month they'll be dried off is mid-January. The month they're going to be finished is mid-April. Their value at dry off is that €1 live weight at 570 kilos, which is €570. Finishing cost is €174, and carcass value using those stats will be €840. So the margin over finishing there is €96. If we take the June calver then as an example, they're going to be dried off in April. They're going to be finished in July. The value of dry off is higher because the live weight value is higher at that stage. So it's €684. The finishing cost is €134. And the reason it's lower for May and June is we're assuming that there's grazed grass, Stuart, in the diet, obviously, at that stage, because they're not being finished till June and July. The carcass value is €859. So the margin over finishing for your June calver is €41. So I suppose really the question, Stuart, and the questions for farmers and people on the call and farmers in general really is there's a margin somewhere between 41 and €96. I suppose there's a number of things to be considered. And we had this chat a couple of weeks ago. In terms of forage availability, I suppose, is one. Infrastructure, in terms of what actually infrastructure is available on the farm. Is there enough feed space? Is there enough cubicle space? There's also, in terms of slurry storage, and I suppose a big one, Stuart, probably as you pointed out to me at that point, was nitrates. These animals are remaining on the farm for a further 90 days. So each individual farmer really have to ask themselves the question in terms of where they are in terms of nitrates, and for that margin, I suppose, is it worth their while? The margin is relatively small compared to the milking margin, sure. Okay.
And I suppose the big thing then there, James, as well, is if you just go to there. So your dry off month is here, obviously, and your month of finishing is in here. So in this period of time, we are now trying to calve our spring calving herd again, and we have an extra bunch of a small bunch in a lot of cases, in reality, on most farms that have to be housed separately or maybe kind of divided off separately, as you've already said, in relation to the infrastructure, because they're being fed differently. But they're also another job that now needs to be done at that stage of the year as well. And the big thing that I would say in this scenario, and I'm probably stealing your finishing a small bit in one sense, there is money to be made in this, but it's small money in the overall scheme of things compared to the cow buyers that are out there that are maybe could be finishing 100 cows every month. So they can be making they might be making a lesser margin potentially, they might be making a greater margin, but they have more of them, so it's worth their while basically doing it compared to every fella doing his own 10 cows basically, isn't it?
Absolutely, and as you say, it's relatively small numbers. You made the point, and I think it's a very valid point in terms of the labour and the fact that there's so much going on farm at this stage. That €41 for your June calf cow, it could end up costing you an awful lot more, Stuart. We're assuming that these don't have an impact on the rest of the herd. And if they do take up that certain amount of time, or possibly putting shed space under pressure or whatever it is, that could be a negative return and not a positive return, you know.
Yeah, and the other side of it, James, I suppose for those later dried off cows as well, in reality, when we look at budgets and stuff like that, the chances of them getting much grazed grass into the system, unless they're going off to an outblock, slim enough.
Slim, absolutely. Absolutely. I suppose where we see those being kept probably is where there's additional outblocks and maybe
And
not being utilized. But I suppose we have to point out the margin is relatively small. And when you total it up, because the numbers are small, it doesn't work into a lot of money.
yeah,
Whereas we can add a lot of value, Stuart, to these late calf cows by actually milking them on. If everything is suitable in terms of being fit to do that on farm.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. If we look at actually combining the milking and finishing margin, what can we actually add in terms of total value to this 100 cow herd? So we had said €9,194 for the margin in terms of milk and all, Stuart. But when we actually combine that with, and our assumptions here is that we're culling 10% of the March calvers, 20% of the April calvers, and as you pointed out, in this situation, this man is saying, right, we're taking out the May and June calvers, we're going to reset. So he's culling out those 8 May calvers, 3 June calvers. So he's working out there, I think it's 17 cows being culled. But when we actually look at it, we've over €9,000 from the milking margin. There's just over €1,000 in terms of that fattening margin for those 17 cows, Stuart. Okay, but when we do combine it, there's over 10 grand. There's €10,319 of a margin on these cows. This is a point, and I kind of alluded to it earlier on, but I think it's an important point. Really look at, for every farm, the farm margin that justifies milking through the winter, it's going to differ on every individual farm. We can see we went through the 100 cow scenario. Obviously, we have that for the 50 cow scenario. So when we look at that milking on margin plus finishing margin, at national average stats for the 50 cow example, it's €5,160. With a good calving pattern, is €2,500. And obviously, when we go to when we double that up in terms of 200 cows, Stuart, there's just over 20,000 available there. And with the poorer calving pattern and with excellent calving pattern, there's 10 grand available. So there does come a point in time where you actually have to say, well, do you know what? It's not worth my while, as you say. If it's the March, April calvers being milked on, they're going to be dried the middle of January. You're not going to milk 10 cows on, and you're definitely not going to milk 5 cows on in the 50 cow scenario. All right.
yeah.
Look at some considerations, and we'll touch on them with the farm example. But labour availability, and you touched on it, Stuart. Now, in terms of the impact on, I suppose, the labour. In a lot of cases, I suppose, and jump in, Stuart, because in a lot of cases, that kind of from the 15th of December until the 1st of February or whenever it is, I think I made the point that there's a bit of time for family, but you rightly made the point that there's a bit of time also not to have to get into the pit of the parlour every day, and it's getting ready for that spring period.
Yeah, I think James Martina makes the point as well. Like, if while you're milking these cows, maybe is there something that you should be doing to prepare for the spring that you just don't get around to doing, or that gets delayed? We'll say kind of knock-on effects of maybe potentially doing this. Like, and as you said, does the positive margin that you're going to incur or reap, we'll say, actually get knocked out somewhere along the way as well, but you just don't ever see it. Kind of that's, and that the no different to me taking the 2 weeks off in the last 2 weeks, that you come back ready for action a bit better, like because of having a break.
Yep, absolutely. And then there's the question, Stuart, I suppose, is it single owner operator units where you're the only person on the farm, or is there actually hired labour available? That doesn't mean, I suppose, that if there's hired labour available, we should just be milking on because we've hired labour. If you don't want to get into the pit of the parlour, there's a good chance that they possibly don't want to get into it for 4 or 5 weeks either. But that does have an impact. I think one thing there too that'll have an impact is possibly milking facility, and I don't think of it mentioned there. Depending on where you are in terms of number of rows of cows throughout the year, and how long it's actually going to take. Sometimes just getting that break from having to milk for that period of time.
And even the layout of a yard, James, as well. Like, I mean, we even see it there with some of the spring calving herds, we'll say, where they're maybe trying to divide cows into different sheds and so forth and crossing yards. And with all the potential raft of changes in legislation that could be coming around trying to keep places clean and diverting water and so forth and not collecting this, it may just not be worth the hassle at all to be doing this. If you're crossing the yard, if it's all under one roof, it can be quite convenient in a lot of cases in some of the newer units that have been built. But if there's a lot of effort required to do this, you'd have to wonder, is it worth people's while? And would it be just better to get it sorted, make sure that they calve on time, breed on time, finish on time, basically dry off and be done for Christmas or shortly after, whatever their usual run is.
Absolutely. And you make the point there. Really, it's going to depend on what percentage of cows have you calving in that April to June period. We worked off 25% in that situation. We're going to look at a farm situation where it's actually slightly higher. But it's really breaking that cycle, Stuart. You know what I mean? If these bulls stay in and the cows aren't sold, the cycle continues as such. So if that's where you want to get to in terms of having the opportunity, and there'll be a lot of farms, Stuart, where they're, because of the revenue involved, they're actually not in a situation where they can make that decision as such, but work towards being in a position to make that decision, I suppose, is the most important point from today. Are there suitable replacements available to make up the difference if later calvers are culled? I think often this is actually maybe an excuse, Stuart, on farm, where there's not enough available. I suppose there's a question then around, is it a closed herd? Isn't, whether it's closed herd or whether it isn't, there's lots of good stock available out there in terms of February, March, early March calving heifers that are available. I think if farmers want to make the move here, when we actually look at the economics, it makes sense to definitely look at those May, June calvers and replace them with a February calved heifer. Herd size we've mentioned. I'm not going to dwell on that again. There is a critical number in terms of how many you milk over the winter. And look, there's lots of other factors. Somatic cell count, and I think that's going to come to the fore, maybe more, Stuart, over the coming years. Where that's at, and will cows benefit from a longer dry period? Milk price. When we run these stats a couple of years ago off a lower milk price, obviously that margin was much less. Cull cow value, and if you can get a good price for cull cows at a particular time, you have to do your sums in terms of, am I better actually trade those cows? Accommodation, which I mentioned, which is very important. Keeping these extra few cows, if it's going to have a negative impact on the rest of the herd because accommodation is tight, you're right, Stuart, those margins we spoke about could turn into negative margins rather than positive margins. Forage quantity and quality, which I think one of our viewers mentioned, and the need for quality forage if we are going to milk these cows on, are a number of considerations. So look at, just maybe for 10 minutes, Stuart, we look at a farm scenario, and if there's any questions there, do feel free to jump in with them. This particular farm I was working with, 41 cows calving in February, 40 in March, 21 in April, 10 in May, and 9 in June. So nearly as many cows calving in June as there was in May, and as many cows calving in May and June as there was in April. So 40 cows, which was 1/3 of the herd calving from April to June. The calving report, actually, in terms of calving interval, wasn't actually that bad. We expected maybe a little bit worse, but I suppose, Stuart, that there was cows calving down in May, and they were still calving down in May the following year as such. You know, they weren't gaining time. The calving spread was up again 20 weeks there, which is a fair old slog. This was an individual owner operator with very little outside labour. And 6-week calving rate was pretty much bang on where we are nationally, Stuart. So look at current replacement rate. I want to draw your attention to that, 13%. Okay.
Very efficient.
Very efficient, absolutely. And we'll look at the problems maybe that was causing. Herd EBI, overall herd EBI sitting at €87. Definitely a move to improving that in the young stock. Whether, I suppose, the question, and maybe the viewers might want to come in on that, whether the young stock are of high enough quality, I suppose, to push this man on to where he wants to get to. There'll always be a debate around that, Stuart, you know. Herd performance, 416 kilos of milk solids delivered, which was the average for that co-op, but there'd be a relatively high level of feed going in on this farm. Protein 331, fat at 373, and average milk price is low and in the bottom 20% of the co-op. But as I said, 13% of a replacement rate with the average somatic cell count for the year at 278,000 just isn't going to cut it going forward, Stuart, and causing lots of trouble within the herd. So I suppose, look, at this is something, Stuart, that we've devised and I've kind of worked through with the farmer as such. It's an on-farm assessment, really, and to work our way through it, look at we're working with some of the details of the calving report. How many weeks was that farmer actually calving for? So the 19 weeks and 2 days. And the number of cows, I suppose, and that's the point. We have to actually look at how many cows are in that April to June period. We want to look at the replacement rate and I suppose comment on that on this farm, it's too low. I suppose the point we made is it's far too low for this farm. And really what was happening was there was a number of heifers being sold to generate income, Stuart, which happens on farm. They're valuable animals. They were being sold and there was May, June calf cows being held on to allow that to happen. But obviously somatic cell count is suffering as a result also. You have to assess at farm level then how many replacements have you and can you actually afford, as I said, can you actually afford to cull out these May, June calf cows? And in this situation, this man has plenty of stock this year, so he can if he doesn't sell the heifers. We looked at the genetics and I suppose there's a question then around are the heifers of good enough quality? And that question has to be answered by the farmer and I suppose also whoever's working with the farmer. So I suppose the plan this farmer come up with that there was 30 to 35 heifers required. There was 15 of these were stock bull bred. So the farmer decided that he was actually going to sell the stock bull bred heifer, Stuart, and purchase in a number of high EBI heifers to get to that kind of 35 heifers required mark to allow them to cull some of them June, May calvers. I suppose in terms of the milk and on question then, you have to ask yourselves, if all these animals are kept, are the facilities there to accommodate them? And in some cases, they won't be. So irrespective of the margin, if the facilities aren't available, you pointed out, Stuart, they're going to have a negative effect on the herd. So they shouldn't be milked on. Is there slurry storage, I suppose, is another critical assessment. And will there be enough forage?
And even James, I suppose, to consider with the slurry storage, are the 10 or 15 cows going to put you under extreme pressure for, in your case, the 1st of February, in our case, the 13th of January, that you're going to be forced to have to spread slurry at maybe in an inopportune time? And would you be just better off to have 10 less cows or 15 less cows over a lot of the winter period to give you that little buffer that you might need in the short term, to make sure that we're not spreading now, which is, look, it's becoming so important from an environmental point of view that we're able to hold our slurry to the point when we can use it more effectively rather than having to go with it.
And misuse of slurry probably is one of the biggest issues out there, Stuart. And it totally, as you say, comes down to pressure point. Actually, it has to be spread, and conditions may not be favourable, both ground and weather conditions. So, but it must go out. So really then we come up with a plan for this particular man. The reason I want to look at this is we look at the economics for this farm. He did, as a result, end the breeding season on the 30th of July. But he decided he's going to milk these cows on. He has the accommodation, he has the slurry storage. We like spending money back up here, Stuart. So there's plenty of sheds, plenty of tank space, and there's plenty of silage. So he's going to milk them on. He's going to add value for and sell them kind of March, April. But he did decide he's going to sell them out of the parlour. He's not going to avail of that finishing margin. So really, in terms of that, when we actually look at the calculations, and the calculations were done, I suppose, to come up and really to show, I suppose, Stuart, that it's the correct decision, and it's not going to have a negative effect in terms of trying to improve his calving pattern. So simply, I'm not going to go through every line again. It's the same kind of table. We have our March calver, the number of cows, the additional litres, the value of them, the additional feed and forage and overhead costs, and the extra margin. So when we actually look, this particular farm had 80 cows that were going to be milked over, albeit 40 of them were going to be dried off in mid-January, but there's still 40 cows there to be milked on. There's 66,730 extra litres, which equates to just over 25,000, 11,500 of feed costs and overhead costs. There's nearly 14,000 euros, Stuart, available of a margin in terms of milking those cows on, and it's just too great not to do it. And I made the point at the start, when these cows are culled as such, I'm not that concerned about it, Stuart, once they are culled. And this particular man, because he has the accommodation and the feed, he's right to milk it on and add value to his culls. All right. Yep. The finishing margin, if he was to do it, and I suppose these had to be calculated out for him, there's about 1,400 quid there in terms of finishing those additional 4, 8, 13, 22 cows. And for 1,400 quid, he said he wasn't going bothering with that. As I said, he's a one-owner operator. He's 120 cows to calve. He's going to sell them at the parlour in that March-April period. But I suppose this was the slide that maybe got us across the line, Stuart, in terms of the decision-making process. When we actually looked at, really, this man's concern was he going to be down money? And that's the concern probably for most of us when we're dealing with anything or making any decision. So all I've done is I've took the May-June calvers, that table from the start that we looked at. Now, don't forget, he's going to milk the May and June calvers on. Okay, he's decided that. So when we actually look, the February calved heifer is going to do about 80%, possibly up to 82 or 3%. Of what their actual potential is, but we worked off 80%. So that heifer is going to deliver 5,200 litres, okay? He has room to milk his culls on. So by replacing half of the May calvers, he didn't make the full jump in 1 year, Stuart, because he just felt it would be too many culls. So he's going to have no cow calved after the middle of May. But replacing half the May calvers and all the June calvers, this particular farmer is actually going to be up 4,218 litres. It's not an awful lot. It's not going to have a big impact.
But the key thing
is
I think
the main point is exactly, he's not down milk.
Yeah.
And I think the important point here and the selling point was he's an opportunity to correct cell count issues, but he's also adding value. He's breaking that cycle and he's adding value to the herd. Has he a more valuable herd if he does this, makes the move, than if he stayed and continued doing what he's doing? Absolutely he has. And as you say, Stuart, the main point is he's not down. He's not actually going to be down milk. Yes, there'll be a small additional cost if someone had to go and purchase the heifers, but in the grand scheme of things, it's usually not a big amount of money.
So that I think to go on, I'll let you finish up there first.
Yeah. So look I think the most important point is really herds with a spread out calving pattern, they can't afford not to milk through. Okay. But it's putting the steps in place that they have a decision that they can actually make the decision in a couple of years' time. So the important point is that the breeding season can still end and we can still add value to our culls. But by bringing in extra heifers or that February calved heifer, we can, as I said, break that prolonged cycle. And as I showed on the last slide, Stuart, we're not going to be down. We're not going to be down big volumes of milk. We're actually going to be up in this case.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. I suppose the reason that we wanted to cover this, that we've been looking at it in the last couple of months, I suppose, is that the people out there challenge us all the time when we talk about culling these cows, and we wanted to put the scenario in place for people to see, like you've done there, work through the financials of it, and I suppose acknowledge that fact that where a calving pattern isn't correct or is off centre, we'll say, that the reality is that you just actually cannot afford to do what we would like people to do in terms of Big Bang Theory. Like, people have other commitments, they have family, they have colleges, they have school fees, etc. All those kind of things coming into play. There's money needed at different times of the year, and people have to generate the money. They can't just take the pain, basically. So I think this is a very good example of how over time we can correct calving patterns, and not necessarily be out of pocket doing it. But the key point, as you said, is that you have to stop the cycle. You have to break the cycle of, if you can't have the May and June calvers again next year unless you're actually going to dispose of them, basically. So to avoid, and look
at Stuart, in some cases it's a matter of chipping away. It's pulling 2 weeks off the breeding season every year, or if it's very extended, maybe 3 weeks and 2 weeks. It chip away at it, as you say. You can do it over a 2 or 3 year period, and then at least you have a decision to make in terms of that overwinter milking and so on and so forth, you know.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing then again, James, coming back to the impact of, we'll say, the drift on the whole farming system. The number of guys that I've encountered down this side of the country that have maybe a week off, maybe between finishing calving and breeding. Now, they're still feeding calves and so forth, obviously, but they're just not watching cows to calve or checking on any cows to calve, albeit only maybe 1 or 2 anyway, in that week before they start breeding. Their breeding season is impacted in 2 senses. They have cows calved and ready to be bred in the vast majority of cases, but they're tuned in the day that breeding start date comes, whatever that date is for given particular geography and so forth. People start at different times, but they're ready to hit the ground running. They're re-energized, basically, because they're not trying to keep thinking of feeding the bit of pre-calve to the one that's still left to be calved, or the couple of cows that are left to be calved. So if you multiply that up with May and June calvers, there's a whole lot going on in people's heads. And it just means that they're not focused on the job at hand then potentially when they should be. So that's there's positive impacts that you can almost not put a financial benefit on, because it's very hard to quantify.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's one very good point again by Tony McCrossan there. So, and I think we probably didn't highlight it actually, James, on the example that you showed there. But should that farmer not also get rid of the stock bull and only use high EBI sires for the future? And I think that's probably something that you did do with him.
That's in place, absolutely. He when the breeding season, that was one condition. When the breeding season ended, he went to the mart. So because if they don't leave the farm, they're inclined to be used. So absolutely. And look, there's one final point, Stuart, and I didn't mention it. I suppose it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg scenario in the fact that which comes first, getting rid of the late calvers and the high 6-week calving rate. We'll never achieve, and you could see that, man, you never achieve high enough submission rates to increase our 6-week calving rate unless those May and June calf cows are sorted out, as you say, because they're just not going to breed in that early breeding season period, you know.
And then just one final question. I've left this one hanging here. Hopefully John is still listening. But John Custon was asking, would it be more economical to start calving in mid-January to avoid the April-May calvers then?
If we go on a farm, Stuart, and we're in a situation where a farm is actually calving, in mid-January. I would sort out the May-June calvers before I would ask them to move calving date. But if we're in a situation where we have, and we work towards compacting that we've no more May-June calvers, we know the economics, we've seen it, we shouldn't really be starting to calve before that kind of end of January, early February. Start a calving.
Very good. So thanks again, James, for coming on. It's a very comprehensive piece of work that yourself and George have done there in relation to that. So, and as I said, I think it's been good to work through that from the point of view that we're often, I suppose, blamed or given out to that we talk about culling these cows, and then we're like you're kind of ignoring that the elephant in the room about the volume and the sum of money that's associated with, or the revenue that's generating for that farm. And it's very easy for us to come in and say, oh, get rid of them. But when you actually put the sums behind it and show what impact it can have on a farm, to just take them out like that, you just have to be able to come up with an alternative option. And your alternative option is that you work your process through over the next 2 or 3 years to get to where you want to, but it's not going to cost you a fortune in the meantime. So thanks, James, for coming on. I suppose just 3 announcements that I want to make. I suppose John Moriarty, who's a colleague of mine here and covers the Nefertiti project, is running a competition there, which is This is Dairying photo competition. What do you love about dairy farming? Just to remind people that that's there if you're interested in entering. And the second thing that I want to announce is that a week's notice, I suppose, for Munster Bovine are going to run a webinar this week, so next Thursday night, and I'll remind you of it again next week. And they're going to cover the new milk performance recording reports, which is a lifetime report, because they've gotten a lot of feedback in the last couple of months that it's not being actually actively used, I suppose, on the ground, or people aren't very aware of it and aren't maybe kind of getting the information that they should be getting out of it, which was why they were developed in the first place. So just a reminder of that. Dennis Howard, Doreen Card, and Tommy DeVate is going to be chairing it, and our own Joe Patton, who actually put the economic figures behind the figures that have been used in those lifetime reports, will also be involved in it on the night. So just to remind people of that. So if you just look it up, I'd say it's being advertised on Facebook and Twitter there at the moment by Munster Bovine, and you should be able to find a link to join it there. And then just to say that I'll be back again next week. I'm just in the process of trying to confirm a speaker for next week. So there's just a kind of a little glitch came in terms of the plan, but we're hoping to be covering a piece of biodiversity work in advance of the hedge cutting season coming about. So just to remind a lot of people about their obligations under derogation, and also the importance of trying to enhance biodiversity at farm level. So we look forward to hopefully having that going in some form next week. So we'll be back at 10 next Thursday, and we'll talk to you then. And in the meantime, take care, and everybody be safe. Okay, so thanks again, James.